Because Portland was such a huge part of the Oregon Trail and Washington itself was a part of Oregon country, the early history of Washington state is a little overshadowed. There is quite a bit of conflict that had occurred here, however. Much of the pioneer history of this region is violent. One of the most notable incidents in early Washington history was the Whitman Massacre. It's a tragic story of how a man trying to do the right thing went horribly, horribly wrong. The story begins with Marcus Whitman. Whitman was a doctor and religious man. He helped create one of the first civilian U.S. settlements in Oregon country. His settlement was near the site of today's Walla Walla, Washington. In fact, he was so determined to establish a foothold in the West, he traveled back east and brought the first wagon train on the Oregon Trail, more or less opening up the trail to the Great Emigration. He's known as one of the more famous early pioneers of the Wild West. Whitman, as a physician, would treat settlers of his community, fur traders in the area, and even the neighboring Cayuse Native American tribe that once lived in today's Oregon and Washington borders. Relations with the Cayuse were tense. Many of the whites Whitman had brought to the region were farmers, which introduced agriculture to the region for the first time. The Cayuse believed that to plow the ground was to desecrate the spirit of the earth, so naturally this caused friction. Also, the huge population boom in the region chased away game, caused wild foods to disappear, and disease began to run rampant. In 1847, a year after Oregon country was divided into the Oregon Territory, a huge measles epidemic hit the region. Whitman, a physician, gave care to both whites and natives in the region. Native Americans, however, were not as biologically resistant to the Eurasian disease. The Cayuse were hit particularly hard, with nearly half of their adults and all of their children dying. The Cayuse also saw that whites were somehow dying at a lower rate than their own. In Cayuse tradition, medicine men are responsible for patient recovery, and therefore they blamed Whitman for their tribe's demise. Cayuse warriors came to Whitman's home where he, his family, and neighbors were slaughtered. Much of the settlement was burned to the ground, and a total of 15 were killed. Much of the events were described by Mary Ann Bridger, the daughter of mountain man Jim Bridger of the Bridger Trail, discussed in episode 12 of the season. Mary Ann Bridger was among the 54 women and children taken as hostages after the massacre. 1 month later, the 49 surviving prisoners were ransomed for provisions. The hostage exchange was not the end of hostilities, however. The provisional government of the Territory of Oregon demanded immediate and prompt action, which led to militia groups sprouting up all over the territory to meet the Native American threat. The Whitman Massacre and the white response led to the Cayuse War. The Cayuse War was a series of battles that would eventually force the Cayuse out of the Columbia River Valley, leaving room for pioneers to settle. The Whitman Massacre had rallied a force of several hundred militia, many of which purchased weapons and supplies from the Hudson Bay Company with the help of the U.S. government. They had the supplies and the men, but the pioneers would have to find their enemy first. The Cayuse were well known for their horseback warfare. They knew the region well, but the measles outbreak had thinned their numbers drastically. The pioneers created Fort Lee, their rally point, on the same site of a Lewis and Clark encampment from 33 years before. They marched east, running into and firing on natives at the Deschutes River. Having pushed the Cayuse back, the militia had gained momentum and pushed deeper into their territory. Once they reached the Umatilla River, they'd encountered more native resistance. The resistance wasn't entirely Cayuse either. They had run into Umatilla, Palouse, and a few Walla Walla braves. The battle lasted 3.5 hours and was deemed inconclusive. 2 major Cayuse chiefs, Gray Eagle and Five Crows, were in the fight. By the end, Gray Eagle was killed and Five Crows was wounded. These chiefs were attempting to unite the regional tribes in a coalition against the whites, but this pseudo-defeat had ended much of their chances of achieving this. The militia marched across the site of the Whitman Massacre and even deeper into Cayuse territory. Near the Tucanon River, they encountered natives flying a white flag who'd confessed much of the stolen livestock from the massacre was at a nearby river. The militia reached the site and found themselves outnumbered by Cayuse warriors 2-1. About 400 to 500 Cayuse attacked the militia for some 30 hours until the pioneers were able to cross the river and form a defense. The Cayuse were disappointed neighboring tribes didn't join the attack, so they dispersed themselves into the Blue Mountains. A few hundred more troops were added to the pioneers' effort, and ransoms were offered to anyone who could give information on the Whitman murderers. In 1850, the remaining Cayuse handed over 5 members to be tried in the Whitman murders. They were all hanged, but this didn't end all hostilities. The tribes of the region distanced themselves from the Cayuse, and over the next several years, Cayuse raids would continue to plague those in the vicinity of the Blue Mountains. The persistence, technology, and manpower of the pioneers was enough to convince the native tribes of the region that working with the Cayuse was a sure way to put their tribe at odds with the U.S. government. A treaty was eventually signed in 1855, which placed the Cayuse into a reservation, along with Umatilla and Walla Walla natives, a move that would bring a flirtation of stability in a region that was about to erupt into yet another war.